Hey, everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have a phenomenal guest, and that is our friend Keith Thompson. Welcome, Keith.
James, great to see you. I've been looking forward to this, engaging the phenomenon. Let's do it.
Likewise, I've been looking forward to having you on. And for people who may not be familiar, Keith wrote a book some years ago, Angels and Aliens, which I have here. It's something of a cult classic in the field. Which we will get into because it actually has some significance in your own story in writing that book. But Keith has also written a new book called The UFO Paradox, The Celestial and Symbolic World of Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, which is right here. We're going to be discussing a lot of this book today, and I highly recommend people look at it because it's a book that's going to expand your aperture, especially if you're a surface dweller, if I could say that. If you're just getting into the UFO phenomenon, or you're somebody that has thought that there's more to it, but you don't know how to start looking in that way, this book is an excellent example of different frameworks that are helpful in expanding your paradigm regarding UFOs. So but just very quickly about Keith. Keith is an author, independent journalist, talk radio host, former TV talk show host, former U.S. Senate staff member, and you have articles that have appeared in New York Times, Esquire, San Francisco Chronicle, among others. And again, you've written Angels and Aliens. And just for people watching and listening now, it's maybe half the audience is going to be familiar with Angels and Aliens. So very briefly, can you explain to people what that book was about?
Sure. The subtitle of the book is UFOs and the Mythic Imagination. Well, I've had a long-term interest in mythology and folklore as serious subjects. I've never believed mythology and folklore belonged in separate departments called mythology and folklore. I think you should read Grimm Brothers fairy tales without the edits, because they're not meant for children only. These are deep stories of the human psyche. So I was always interested, or I became interested in how the figures of mythology, following Carl Jung and James Hillman, are paradigms for human. You study mythology to study the human condition, frankly. So with that in mind, I was struck as I wanted to delve into the UFO subject. What could we learn by looking at mythic patterns? For example, there's a god from the Greek mythic pantheon named Proteus, a prolific shapeshifter who would become whatever he needed to be in any situation. And I said, there's a huge parallel there to the UFO phenomenon. It literally does shift its shape, and it can be whatever you want it to be, depending on the questions that you ask it. Are you extraterrestrial? It can display behaviors consistent with extraterrestrial. Are you interdimensional? Are you from parallel universes? It'll give you yes to that too. So that was the approach I took in the book. People said, well, you never really addressed, are they real? I said, they're real in this mythological sense. In this newer book, I said, okay, now I want to step out of mythology, step more into ontology. What are we really dealing with here? And to what extent do we need to look beyond the aperture, as you put it, of the UFO field? So that's what I tried to do in this new book.
And I also have to note again, Angels and Aliens. If you can get a hold of it, I think everybody should read that book. Who takes the UFO subject seriously? A lot of people are initially, they may have a knee-jerk reaction and say, what do aliens and angels, what do UFOs have to do with angels? I mean, you have to, again, keep the beginner's mind, right? And see that there's larger patterns at play.
Well, and
uh,
also that the term myth, I deal with this in both books. I said the myth in our culture has come to stand for fanciful, figurative, false. That's just a myth, we hear politicians
right.
say about their opponents. But there's a far deeper register of myth. Myth refers to something beyond mere fact. It refers to truths deeper than true or not. So I have a very positive approach to myth, but yeah, people say, oh, he's taking a mythological approach to the UFOs. They're nothing but myth. Isn't that what debunkers say? Yeah, debunkers will use the word myth. So these terms, we've got to try to reown them, take them back from. I'm a big believer, for example, I call myself a liberal. I don't mean that simply politically, but in my approach to life is liberal. And the original sense of liberal, it really does mean free, means free to think, free to speak, free to assemble. So the term liberal does not just mean not conservative, in the political. But if I call myself a liberal, people will assume I'm, they'll make
And
assumptions.
that's, yeah, and that's why I think people have to read these books, is because, as with any subject, but I mean, I see it all the time in the UFO subject. I can say alien, right? And somebody from a current generation, younger people, may just assume that's, when I say alien, I mean extraterrestrial. But if I say that to a fundamental Christian, they're thinking, oh, he's talking about those angels or demons. Or if I say it to somebody of the Muslim faith, they might say, oh, he's talking about a jinn.
Not the
So,
gym.
right. So we don't even have a lexicon that we have a full consensus of. So it's we have to
It's
be,
absolutely true. It's
yeah, we
absolutely.
have,
I've told people, we've all have, if we're into the UFO stuff at all, we are, if we're talking about it, there is a sense in which you almost find yourself, I've called myself a Gnostic.
yeah,
What I mean by that in this subject is the Gnostics were that various branches of religion that had to lay low because they would be writing about a subject that maybe the mainstream orthodoxy didn't approve of. I mean, we see these debates in religious studies, the heretics, the Gnostic tradition. So as I was writing this book, when I would meet a new person, oh, Keith, you're a writer. What are you writing on? I would look at the ways not to answer the question.
yeah,
I would look at the ways not to say I'm writing a book about UFOs. You don't want to have the airplane conversation when you're sitting next to the passenger. Oh, what do you do? I'm a writer. What are you writing about? UFOs. Then you've got 20 minutes of their opinions about what
yeah,
they think UFOs. So you believe aliens are real? I said UFOs, unidentified flying objects. By the acronym stands for we don't know for sure what it is, or it's up for question. Yeah, but you believe, and so you have a scripted conversation. So the irony now is I've gone from being a UFO Gnostic and writing about the book in my metaphoric monastery. Hold up. Now I'm out talking with you and other people because the book is out now. So now I've gone from being I'm a public person now about a subject that I was holding very dear. And that's part of I think that's part of the boundaries of this phenomenon. It's officially non-existent, or very recently, until very recently, it's been officially non-existent. Now we've given the acronym UFO an acronym upgrade, rechristened it to UAP, but there's still a lot of ambiguity and ambivalence about this topic.
yeah. And I want to say again, for the new book, something that I really appreciated about the new book, the UFO Paradox, was you made it. This one was much more personal than Angels and Aliens, and to me, that gave a transcendental quality, a relatable quality. It, in a sense, which we're going to get to. You almost had your own hero's journey in writing the book. I mean, that's the way I saw it. Like I saw your own kind of like from Angels and Aliens to the book, the UFO Paradox, that kind of cycle, which we're going to get into those. But, people here might be seeing you for the first time, or this might be the first interview that they hear with you. So how did you come to writing these books?
Good question. The reason I ended up writing about my own personal experiences finally was because I saw what happened to people in the UFO field who got caught midway on their hero's journey. I use the hero's journey very decidedly in the book, an initiatory framework. And so I won't go deeper into that now. You can ask me later. But in terms of my own journey, frankly, I had experiences, not with UFOs. Interestingly, it did have something to do with the sky. And in that sense, the following is my introduction to a larger world, put it this way. When I was 14 years old, I used to go up on the roof of our family house. I was the third of four kids. And as a middle kid, I had a lot of freedom to be independent, and my needs were taken care of. And we had a family where we could relate about what we could relate about and so forth, pretty normal. But I spent a lot of time thinking about things that were unusual, and always sensed there was some larger picture. So I would go up on the roof of our family house. I'd climb up a TV antenna that was built into the ground. It was like a ladder. We were not allowed to climb up onto the roof, but I did. And it was a big house in a suburban neighborhood. And one day, I'm just laying on my back and looking into the sky, perfectly beautiful blue sky without purpose or aim. And I suddenly had, there was a flash of brilliance all around me. And I felt instantly that I was everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. And I had a sense of awakened, that there's a sense that awareness itself is awake. This place is awake, and that includes me. And let me just say, it's, in retrospect, it was a classic mystical illumination. My family had no religious orientation to speak of. We would go to church because it was good for good people to be seen going to church. You know, we were socially oriented. I had no deep religious convictions, but I knew that I'd had an experience on center court, uh, a God experience, an experience of the divine, spirit, soul, the Tao, all the terms that I became familiar with when I eventually went on a spiritual journey to sort of investigate what had happened that day, read Alan Watts and other spiritual teachers. So that that moment on the roof, which I came down from, I didn't go inside, hey, mom, I just had the experience that I'm everywhere and nowhere at once. No, I didn't do that. It would not have been good. They didn't medicate people in those days, but I would have been a candidate.
Yeah.
Instead, I lived with a sense of of a larger world, and I kept it to myself. Not because I was ashamed of it or embarrassed or because I doubted it, but because I thought I had seen the more that is always already here, and that I knew there were other people who had. And when I read Alan Watts and I read other spiritual teachers outside any of the orthodoxies, I said, I'm not alone. So how that brought me to UFOs, I frankly think, in retrospect, James, that I had chose the UFO subject as a kind of a framework with which I could write about larger experiences in general. It gave me a way to hold my own experience rather than writing about what's it like to have a spontaneous mystical illumination. Maybe I'll write about that in the future. Instead, from that place, I wrote about the UFO stuff, but not having any UFO experiences myself. I will say this though, my father was an airplane pilot, and we had a family airplane. We'd go up a lot. My dad would take me. So you want to go flying? He'd say to me sometimes, of course I want to go flying. That's the best possibility I can think of. And I was his co-pilot, which meant I sat next to him. And the main thing is I was not allowed to go to sleep. He didn't like when you'd have any of us in the plane and we'd go to sleep. He feels it's not respectful, was his attitude. But my father showed me and shared with me his love of the open sky. He would talk with me about the sky and about currents and wind. I said, how do you know where the wind is coming from? And those kind of, he would teach me about the control panel and all the dials. So that's a kind of long answer, but it gives you sort of a way, a framework for how he came into this, not specifically through the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah. And, the experience you described almost sounds again like you can use names like Satori or awakening. Those kind of terms ring bells.
Yeah, it's these days the term non-dual is big,
Yeah.
non-duality.
Advaita. Yeah.
Advaita and the traditions of Buddhism, Dzogchen and
Yeah.
Mahamudra, these fancy terms, but they are the so-called direct path to seeing instead of this long-term gradualist approach to meditation, which I have done. I find meditation very useful, but there's a curious way in which the gradualist path can set up a independent seeker for that which can be seen at any moment. And I had a direct seeing. And by the way, when I don't, one reason I kept this to myself is because maybe because I come from the Midwest, a certain sense of, you don't talk about yourself all the time.
Yeah.
And you certainly don't talk about, well, I had a spontaneous mystical illumination. Have I told you? No.
Yeah.
It just didn't come from a family where that was done because it sounds like an achievement. So much spirituality is a lot of boasting. I had this very powerful experience with this teacher. I'm going to show you my passport of spiritual retreats I've done. And understandable. We all domesticate all these experiences in ways that we can. But I guess it was an experience of non-duality, and yet you have to live in duality in order to make it in this world. So I came down from the roof that day, James. I said, I have become the entire universe. I am the entire universe. We are all always, in some sense, not separate from the entire universe. And I'm also Keith. That's my assignment here. My dad is over there, and I want to relate to him as his son, not as the whole universe. It won't go well if I relate to him as if I'm the whole universe and he is too. That won't work out. So there's a kind of, I call it psychic mobility that one learns. Uh, Hopefully, you go from the very big register of there is no separation between myself and everything else to the recognition that in some situations it is good to identify with being a separate self. You have a birth certificate, you've got photographs of your childhood. It goes with this assignment, and I kind of do think we have an assignment. The human thing. We could go down this road or not, but the human situation is we are somehow in I think, in some sense, the soul seeks a human birth. If might as well just kick out the jams here. I think the soul seeks limitation. Like, what could the soul learn next? How about practice limitation? How about practice identifying with a body and imagining that you are your body? And then several years later, after my rooftop experience, I had a near-death experience before the near-death experience was even known. So I may be jumping all over the place, but those are some aspects of what bring me into this and help me hold it in a place that might be more expansive.
Yeah, I do want to get into the near death experience in a little bit. Um, and the kind of transformative qualities that such experiences have. But I also wanted to touch on, early on, you ended up writing a report for school on UFOs.
Yeah, okay, then that's my actual, thank you. That's my actual introduction to the UFO topic. Great. I just talked about my personal experiences that oriented me philosophically and ontologically, to use the big term from philosophy. But when I was 12 years old, it was my turn to give a current events class in my sixth grade class. And I was living in Northwest Ohio, where I grew up, and right next to Michigan. And the famous Hillsdale swamp gas case was in full it was a full happening, 3 or 4 days of lights and craft. And J. Allen Hynek, the Air Force investigator, consultant, flew in, as he dutifully did, and he visited all the hot spots, including a place out near the end of town, near the swamp or the marsh. And after talking with a lot of people, seeing various sites, he stepped up to the obligatory news conference with all the reporters in the metal chairs sitting in the school auditorium. And I saw all this on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. I grew up watching news. I felt the news is how I always kind of wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be part of that world. So I loved tracking the news. So this case was fascinating to me. So he came to the news conference and he said, I can't explain all of this, but I can say with some degree of confidence that maybe the sighting at the edge of town near the such and such swamp might have been could have been possibly swamp gas. He stood there mortified as the reporters jumped out of their seats, out into the hall, the row of payphones that had been set up, called the news bureaus. Hynek dismisses the sightings, swamp gas. I knew that is not what he did. He speculated about that in one specific instance. It might have been swamp gas. I got a real strong introduction in that to the way this is. There's a doubleness to this phenomenon, what gets reported. Some people say that was part of Hynek's cover-up. No, it wasn't. He was misunderstood, misquoted. It led to a great deal of outrage. So I talked about this in my class. I talked about this. One of the students says, well, do you think they're extraterrestrial? Are they from outer space? And I remember even then I said, well, that's an interpretation some people have. I don't know. Which, what do you think they saw? And I said, well, I don't know. But and I said that, and that I said to myself, I now that was not a dodge, that wasn't punting. I didn't know what they saw, but I do know, and I did know then that it didn't resemble swamp gas. So at that point, my teacher, Mrs. Lowry, spoke up. She said, I think what Keith is trying to say, it's important to keep an open mind and ask relevant questions. James, I have never in my life, that was one of the first times outside of family and friends, that was like a benediction. It was like a blessing. Here was an adult, a school teacher, who was saying, what Keith has done here is a contribution. He brings something to this. These are good qualities. Keep your mind open, ask good questions. And so, and then she added, she goes, Keith, you have a very good report. She called me Mr. Thompson, you know, the way teachers do it. Well, Mr. Thompson, that was a very good report. You have the makings of a scientist or a journalist, maybe a detective. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. All right, we're going to go out for the recess. That was a life transforming experience for me because it taught me. I didn't know the word empiricism, what it meant to be empirical, but follow the evidence where it leads. Follow observation. So that is defined. I continued. That was my orientation to the UFO phenomenon. It introduced me to it. I continued to follow. How could you not be interested in a phenomenon that, as a journalist, let's say, just as a story? How would Tom Wolfe and Kurt Vonnegut not have understood the story potential? Hunter Thompson, the same name, but not the same person, would have seen the potential of his story. We have credible reports from credible people throughout the world of truly incredible, supernatural type phenomena that, as they appear, that as soon as they give witness to it, a professional class of agents of official culture in the media, science, academia, no, that didn't happen. That couldn't have happened. That doesn't happen because we know the laws of science. The laws of science. I thought, this is just too good. The story potential is this deadlock that happens when good faith reports get made, they get automatically dismissed. They get pushed down into the deep psyche. That's what a big part of Angels and Aliens was about. The sense in which this phenomenon becomes all the more numinous and symbolic and highly charged because it gets pushed down. Think of anything in our own families. We know that the family secret that doesn't get dealt with doesn't go away. It defines 3 or 4 more generations. The thing that we didn't talk about back then. That's why family therapy, systems therapy, is so wise in doing that. So anyway, that was my orientation. I became an empiricist that day, and it also taught me, James, that I could, when the paranormal dimensions of this began to appear, I said, well, I don't know much about the paranormal, but the evidence suggests it's a consistent part of the phenomenon. So I made it my business to study the paranormal. Besides, I'd had a pretty powerful, I wouldn't call it paranormal experience on my rooftop, but I had an experience of awakened mind as being the state of everything, always. So with that framework of a profound sense of a larger identity, I just kept tracking this and then meeting people in the field, being welcomed into the discussion. It's a great opportunity. Anything in your life, listeners, viewers, that you're interested in, follow it. Get in touch with the people in the field. You'll find that they'll be willing to talk to you. You can make your way into any topic.
Yeah, and there is an interesting note that you brought up there with Dr. J. Allen Hynek in how his, when the swamp gas kind of issue, which is not often understood as it was, and how you describe it and you report on it, and that gets into a subject of perception versus interpretation, which you also touch up on in the new book, and you delve into it with let's say Kenneth Arnold and the making of a modern myth in that regard. So can you speak to how perception and interpretation, and then almost the cascade effect after that, like the whole how it went from Alan Hynek saying, well, this one incident could have been swamp gas, to all UFOs are swamp gas?
And weather balloons, that's the other go-to
Right.
from
Yeah.
the debunker's bag. We could talk about the difference between genuine skepticism and debunkerism. Debunkerism is not skepticism. It's not science. It's a form of crowd control. But with the Kenneth Arnold, let's talk about that. In Angels and Aliens, and also in this book, I said, oh, this is the Arnold sighting is the creation myth of the modern UFO phenomenon. And I looked back, I'd studied the creation myths of various Aboriginal and indigenous cultures, whereby they take the boys or the girls out into the initiation huts and teach them the myths of the culture. Our people, where our people, the Dogon, let's say, the Dogon people of Africa, where we come from. Invariably, we come from the sky.
Yeah.
So I said, Kenneth Arnold is the creation myth. He is the progenitor. He's the protagonist of a modern creation myth. And so, as you say, the difference between perception and interpretation and what got reported, he said he saw 9 objects flying near Mount Rainier that in formation, and they moved the way saucers might move over water. That became Kenneth Arnold, a businessman from Boise, Idaho, reports seeing 9 flying saucers. It was assumed that he said they were shaped like flying saucers. A witty essayist named Martin Kottmeyer said, "Well, this introduces a first-order paradox. Why would the aliens, why would the extraterrestrials subsequently change the shape of their objects to match a journalist's error?" Because the journalists said that they looked like flying saucers. Well, we've seen flying saucers ever since. Did that mean the phenomenon changed in order to meet our expectation? At one level, I think the answer to that is yes. I've already mentioned Proteus, the Greek god who's a shapeshifter. But in any case, Arnold said they move like saucers, then flying saucers were seen. For me, the real story came 2 decades later. His daughter Kim Arnold told an interviewer that her father, who was now no longer here, was constantly mystified that people thought he had reported extraterrestrial spacecraft, nuts and bolts hardware. Nothing of the kind. She said that her father said the objects were were of different densities of blue, white light. They changed their form as they moved. He thought they were living. They had the beat similar to a heartbeat. And he told me later that that they they led him to a deep intuition of being from a realm, a different dimension. And it is the realm that we go to after this life. Well, he obviously didn't say that at the time. He already was considered a national joke for reporting flying saucers. Can you imagine what it would have been like if he had described that publicly at the time? He probably would have had to pass a psychiatric test to get a renewal of his pilot's license at minimum. So he told that to his daughter. So the myth, if you will, and I mean myth in a positive sense, the myth of Kenneth Arnold, the myth of the flying saucer has continued to evolve. Can you imagine? What if he had announced that they were living, breathing objects, beings with various densities of transparency and opaqueness that seemed to be from another realm? Would have changed how we maybe would have been thinking about this phenomenon, the consistent esoteric or spiritual dimension of this. One more thing. He went home that day to Boise in his private plane after talking with reporters at the airport. And in his family home that night, there began to appear orbs of light, like Skinwalker Ranch type stuff. Okay, debunkers, you don't think it happens. It does happen. The orbs are a consistent part. So lights flashing throughout the home. Well, there's a synchronicity there, and we can talk about the subject of synchronicity, the correspondence between physical states and the psychological state. This was something that was part of this man's calling. This was not a random. To say it was not a random sighting might give the wrong impression.
Right.
It was a meaningful sighting. When I say it wasn't random, oh, that implies there's some larger network and all of that. But non-random means there was something that was part of his calling. I framed this book. I originally had a different title. I was going to call it something like A Call from the Cosmos.
Right.
I feel the UFO phenomenon is a calling from the cosmos to expand our maps of reality. And in that calling, many of us have our own callings. I had a calling on my family rooftop. I later had a calling, if you will, call is an interesting thing. What are we called to? It's a whole different kind of psychology. So Kenneth Arnold had a sighting that was a kind of a calling. And again, the connection with what emerged in his family home, odd lights and so forth. So anyway, it's a these are questions that go beyond the UFO phenomenon as a single frame of reference. This phenomenon, at some point in my own journey, I had to say, I may not vote for this to be a phenomenon that opens to the near-death experience, that opens to shamanism, that opens to the fairy faith, as Dr. Jacques Vallée so consistently pointed to with his marvelous book, Passport to Magonia. If you're a serious student of this subject, well, thank you very much for recommending my former book, Angels and Aliens. But please be sure Passport to Magonia is on your list, because what Jacques Vallée did in that book was to say, I'm not saying they're not real. I'm saying they're real, and they've been going on for centuries, and that this appears to be a phenomenon that gives specific and particular cultures phenomena to deal with in their own terms, in their own beliefs. So it's a bigger picture than just the modern Kenneth Arnold 1947.
Right. And, again, what Kenneth Arnold experienced, as you made the reference to Skinwalker Ranch, to kind of reframe that for some people, that's akin to saying, like, okay, Kenneth Arnold had something of what we consider today the Hitchhiker Effect, right? Where,
Yes, it came home with him. It came home. I had not made that connection yet.
yeah,
It
so
came home with him, and you probably talked with in previous shows. I know you've talked about
with Column,
the
yeah, I had Column on, and yeah, so, and which he's done excellent work describing that, again, the Hitchhiker Effect, or uh, there's other, post encounters, post encounter effects, post effects of close encounters. There's different ways to look at that, and I know
Well, and the Close Encounters is a great example. People say that's just a film. Well, Spielberg worked very closely with Jacques Vallée as a
yes,
consultant on that film, and Jacques actually wanted him to go further out than just
yeah,
the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And Spielberg wisely said, Jacques, I agree with you. This is not just a doesn't seem to fit just that frame. But I work in a town called Hollywood, and I
yeah,
need a film that people can relate to. So I think quite wisely he made it a clear ET mothership that was going to land. And that's consistent with a lot of the data. But those motherships that land also disappear on the spot, like
yeah,
turning off a TV set. So there's the paranormal. The sense in which, when I say paranormal, it's not a term I really like. Although Jeff Kripal, our mutual friend, said, I want to resurrect the term paranormal. It's not a bad term, but it's metanormal, supernormal. It's the sense in which there are phenomena that do not obey the Western materialist distinction, scientific framework that says we keep mind over here, matter over here, never the twain shall meet. The UFO phenomenon didn't get the memo.
yeah,
And so it consistently transgresses that division. And the idea, well, we don't have any evidence that there's no, we know, again, the debunkers will say, well, the laws of nature change. I mean, nature is not finished revealing its secrets to us. That's something I continue to expand my own thinking. I often say, when you have phenomena that consistently and coherently show up through the UFO phenomenon, the near-death experience, and the evidence for paranormal phenomena has been proved statistically and scientifically by good people like Dr. Dean Radin of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, a great respect for what he's done. When you have data that show that there are territories that don't show up on the maps of science and society, at some point you say, has anybody checked the maps lately? Are they up to date? Are they accurate? What I'm about is saying we need broader maps. The territory is here. The maps are inadequate in the same way they were when villagers in the 18th century said there are hot, fiery rocks falling from the sky. Learned men of the academy said, no, there aren't. That
yeah,
doesn't happen. Even Thomas Jefferson, a learned man, and he said, no, there aren't rocks falling from the sky. They'd go out and see the stones on the ground. Oh, burn marks. The villagers have applied fire. Hoax. They're hoaxes. No, they're called meteors. there were rocks falling from the sky, fiery rocks. So we don't have the full story. And that's what I'm sort of speaking to, an exploratory context for continuing to ask the big questions.
Yeah, and you mentioned the paranormal and supernormal, and Dr. Dean Radin, who I've interviewed here, also he wrote an excellent book called Supernormal, and it delves into kind of some of the science, the experiments regarding, again, a term we use, paranormal, meaning, again, supernormal, metaphysical. They're all trying to describe something that is within our reality as we can see it, but it's something super extra, just only in the sense that we don't fully understand it. And as you wrote in the book, and as Dr. Dean Radin has said, and others who worked in programs regarding remote viewing and the like, Project Stargate, is that the effect is observed. The big problem that science and skeptics have with it is they just can't explain how it's working, and therefore,
That's right.
yeah,
Dean talks about that. He had a conversation with Ray Hyman, of Skeptic, and a controversial figure and so forth in the intelligence world. But he said, Dean, at this point, I'm willing to concede. You're right. You've got a signal here. This is a very clear signal in the noise. Okay, you've met the standard. And Dean says, well, then you'll join me in publicizing this, will you? Is that what I hear you saying, my friend? And he said, well, no. And why not? Well, because we don't have an idea what the mechanism is. Well, we don't have an idea of the mechanism of gravity. Have we explained the mechanism of gravity? We don't
right,
deny that gravity exists. The effects of gravity are felt. Psi effects, PSI or paranormal effects are felt. So we don't know the mechanism. Well, Thomas Kuhn, in his marvelous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, about how paradigms work, they work by accumulating a coherent worldview with very few anomalies. At the height of a paradigm success, a paradigm is a worldview. It's a picture of reality that makes sense. You're lucky if you live in a period when things make sense. We live in a time when things don't make sense, which is to say that there are increasing number of anomalies at the mind-matter interface. So Kuhn said the accumulation of anomalies causes ordinary scientists to give up normal science for a while and start batting away these anomalies, trying to explain them. Maybe they're just glitches in the methodology. And that's a good question. You should look for glitches. Maybe they aren't real anomalies. Maybe they're pseudo anomalies. But we have enough anomalies now. And he famously said, he quoted the physicist whose name escapes me at the moment, science proceeds one funeral at a time.
right.
Namely, the advocates of the old order who do nothing but try to bash the anomalies and get rid of them, rather than incorporate the anomalies. Well, a new generation of scientists comes along in any number of fields, UFOs. And near death is a very good example of how the best scientists are men and women who actually started as hardcore skeptics, like the doctors who talk to a patient after surgery and says, I'm ready to tell you your prognosis. And the patient says, you don't need to tell me. I overheard you telling the other doctor in the other wing of the hospital. And by the way, that tie you were wearing yesterday with mustard on it, did you get the mustard out? And by the way, there's a tennis shoe on the roof of the
Yeah,
building next to here. And the doctor, gets up off the floor after, nearly fainting. It's, what are you talking about? And it turns out that the doctors and the medical and scientific people who study the near-death experience are people who began as debunkers. And they had the courage and integrity to say, I didn't come into science to do PR work. I didn't come in to do crowd control. I'm not here to reassure people. And Galileo saw what he saw, and the church told him to shut up. He didn't shut up about the Earth orbiting the sun, and they put him in house arrest. Well, they haven't arrested people for confirming that the near-death experience is real. I don't get any knocks on my door about the UFO phenomenon. So I think a larger paradigm is gradually emerging. It won't be announced in the New York Times. Paradigm shifted, crowds out of control in St. Louis as the new paradigm takes hold. No, it's not going to work that way. But we will end up with a worldview in which matter and mind are understood as at best complementary aspects of a larger third thing. And I think actually we're going to find that consciousness is as fundamental as gravity, and probably more fundamental than time and space. We're already getting good work from Donald Hoffman, the neuroscientist, who says that time and space are provisional. They're not fundamental. That's a pretty big idea right there. Time and space are just like a game board on a larger ocean of consciousness. I think we're in for a really exciting ride.
And that's something I really love about the UFO phenomenon. I always say that the UFO phenomenon almost serves as a bridge between physics and metaphysics, just because you have these seemingly or apparently physical objects that could be tracked on radar and on gun camera footage and seen physically by witnesses and what have you. Yet they're performing feats like instantaneously dematerializing, rematerializing, telepathy, all these kind of things we associate with metaphysics. And not quite exactly, but in your book, you discuss a little bit about what you were just referring to, and that was the signals of transcendence.
Oh, that's a favorite part of the book for me. I was a sociologist named Peter Berger who wrote a beautiful little book in the 1970s, and I still had it on my shelf called A Rumor of Angels. And it was about the alleged disappearance of the supernatural. Now, he was not a Jungian, he was not a believer in the supernatural, he was a sociologist. But he said just because we dispatch the supernatural, just because we exile it, doesn't mean it goes away. Because he had this beautiful phrase where he said, the ordinary state of consciousness, the baseline state of consciousness in our culture is like the guy who goes for a business lunch and has a couple of martinis, and a certain kind of drowsy torpor takes over. Meanwhile, the transcendent doesn't go away. Now, the supernatural. Now, I know that many people might say, well, to call this phenomenon supernatural implies that it violates the laws of nature. I understand that's what the debunker will often say. Well, it would have to be supernatural. Miracles that break the laws of nature. Well, actually, they don't break the laws of nature. They break our expectations. They tell us that there are theories that we hold that the data are not consistent. So an anomaly is not a new aspect of nature. Nature has already voted on its own content and its own contents. An anomaly is something that shows up that isn't predicted by the prevailing viewpoint. So Peter Berger wrote about signals of transcendence that if we pay attention in our midst, he gave a beautiful example. It's a stormy night. The baby wakes up crying, lightning and thunder. And the mother goes in to the child's room, takes the baby in her arms. She says, there. It's all right. Everything's fine. Berger raised the question, is that true in that moment? Is she telling the truth that everything's all right? A signal of transcendence is when you ultimately trust that being is okay. You trust being. So by reassuring a child on a stormy night that it's really all okay, it tells the child it is thundering and there's lightning in the sky and it seems dangerous and things are okay. That allows that child to step out of the immediate framework of this seems like a dangerous situation, transcending that moment to open to that it's still okay. I'm being held by my mother. So the analogy, Berger didn't develop this, but I took it to say that there are that these phenomena that we open up to, we find that we're okay. We can trust being. Doesn't mean there aren't dark forces and difficult forces, and some of the abductions are extremely difficult to process, and that's a whole larger question maybe we'll get into. But ultimately, I'm a big advocate of working with abductees or people who've had difficult experiences to help them find a place to say, and how are you right now? You're right here. There's resilience, and you've opened to a larger reality. And that's where I developed the initiatory idea. We separate from a previous framework that made sense. We end up for maybe a long time, many years of life, in a marginal, transitional, betwixt and between phase. And then finally, there's the return. Joseph Campbell said, the hero's journey is not complete until the hero, the traveler, the journeyer, comes back to the community, to the tribe he or she left, with a boon BOON, a reward, and a teaching, an insight. And I saw this in case after case with successful experiencers, if you will, who delved into their experience and came through it, like Emily Trim at the Zimbabwe sightings, the aerial school, like Calvin Parker of Pascagoula. I mean, we could discuss these cases in detail, but they both spent a long time in the marginal zone where there was lightning and thunder in their lives because they had seen something that was officially non-existent and they weren't supposed to have seen, and they were supposed to have forgotten and pushed away. That doesn't work very well in most areas of life. Suppressing it might be a coping strategy. We all have to put things out of sight and out of mind sometimes just to get on with the day. But we have to come back to them because it will come back to us. So I think of the phenomenon, the disclosure phenomenon. I think disclosure is a powerful metaphor. I think remembering is a powerful metaphor too. I think we're remembering something with the UFO phenomena. And I think in a deep sense, what we're remembering is that the division between the mental and the physical is not absolute, that there is a larger register of a deeper unity in this universe. And I think that's a big part of the cosmos sending us a message. This is news from the universe. The UFO is news from the universe. The near-death experience is news from the universe. It's a bigger game, folks. Are you humans ready to play a bigger game? That's what I think we're being asked to do.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of Dr. John Mack's Passport to the Cosmos. I love how he framed that. And what you're describing, I had the hero's journey kind of thing, and how for Emily Trim, it took many years for her to come back to that experience from the aerial school phenomena. And for me, I had early experiences that were a little frightening to me, but relevant at the time, and that ended up coming back into my life maybe 15 years later, and it kind of surfaced and had that kind of emergence factor. But
And I think there's a wisdom in that, whether you knew it or not. You were what you did there, and I know what I did in terms of my own big experiences because I couldn't tell them. There's a line in the book, a poem by the German Goethe. He said, "Tell a wise person, or else keep silent,
yeah,
because the mass man will mock it right away. Tell another person who knows this secret, or else keep silent, because the collective will squash you, will mock you, as Harvard did with their esteemed professor, Dr. Mack." So there's a way in which when we hold back, there's a kind of, we live in a time everything is supposed to be disclosed all the time. We're supposed to tell all. We live in a confessional culture. I'm a big believer that there are times to contain an experience. Hold it back. Keep it on the down low. Tell a few people so that you don't go crazy, but allow it to germinate. Allow it to come to some fruition. The psyche works on a very different scale of time than the clock time. Uh, that experience will be ready for any of us when we're ready to actually engage it, maybe with a therapist, a counselor, a support group of some kind, or just the truth telling that I felt when I was writing this book. I'll tell you briefly. I was reading the story of Emily Trim at the Zimbabwe sighting, the aerial school. 8 years old, I believe, at the time. She had a particularly powerful experience of locking eyes with the alien. I'll just call it an alien because that's just the common vernacular. And the alien looked back. There was something about the eyes that was very haunting. And she was from a family that was deeply Christian and rather conventional, fundamental Christian. And her parents essentially said, "This didn't happen. I know you all saw it, but it didn't." And they actually pulled Emily and her brother out of the school and went back to Canada. So for many years, Emily didn't deal with this until she did get an invitation to come back to aerial school many years later for a reunion. I mean, how fantastic that it happened through a reunion, a ceremonial initiatory event. How often people go to a reunion and they find a classmate, they end up, that's their second marriage. A reunion is a very powerful thing because you're returning in time. So she returned to aerial school and she went into the community and somebody said, "Would you like to go meet the local Duke is his name, the local indigenous shaman?" She goes, "Yes. How did we manage to go to school here in this little enclave called Ariel? And we never met any of the indigenous teachers." I would like that. They drove out into the hinterlands, and Duke welcomed her and sat down and said, "So I understand you're asking the question, young lady, whether you should talk about this." She said, "Yes, that is it. Well, of course you should talk about it. You have a story to tell, and you must tell it. You told it, you saw it as a child, and your testimony as a child is very powerful." And she got it. She would not have had that. She went back to Canada. She returned to her artwork. Her parents, she and her parents had a reconciliation. Her parents finally said, "Something did happen that day, Emily. We now know it. And we didn't see it and we didn't say it. You had the," and her parents said, "Don't speak of it." Duke said, "Shout it." So there are those moments when it becomes time. And so with this, the reason I brought this case up was I was working on this case and I had a dialogue, you might say, with my own daimon. That part of me, the daimon is the Greek term for that part of who we are that is not who we think we are. It's another part of ourselves from the unconscious. It's a calling. It's a voice. So I, if you will, had a conversation, metaphoric conversation. Should I bring my own story into the book about my own childhood mystical experience and my own near-death experience? And the response was, "Do you want your book to be true?" I said, "Thank you." So I decided I would bring my own story into the book. And in the process of doing that, James, I realized I had had a view that as a journalist, you never talk about your own experience. You keep that on the outside. Who says we can't be objective about our own experience? The idea that we don't have any history, that we don't have experiences that make us want to be a journalist, want to be a scientist. Gary Nolan at Stanford has a very powerful day job. He's probably going to win a Nobel Prize or two. And he's had powerful experiences and he has decided to start speaking about them. They can both be true. So yeah, I'm a big believer in there's a kind of containment where you allow the powerful experience to be contained and held dear. But at some point, we have an obligation. And part of the shifting of a paradigm is more people come forward and said, "Yeah, this is true for me too. And I'm going to survive the onslaught of the community." It turns out the community is generally more responsive than we expect.
Yeah, and I think that part of you sharing your experience made the book very profound. And for people listening, do you want to go ahead and talk about an experience that you shared about a near death experience?
Yeah, I will, and I'll keep it brief. I've kind of learned there's a long version. It's almost a book to be written.
I
I,
I completely understand.
Yeah, so
Because
I will try to use a wise economy of words here. I was in my 20s, went from California where I was living to Hawaii to run the Honolulu Marathon in my 20s. A group of us went, we rented a house. It was a fantastic trip. And one of my friends on the trip was Mary. She and her boyfriend came. Name was Mary. And so the day after the marathon, we went to the north side of the island, beach called Sunset, do a little body surfing. I got in over my head. The riptides were amazing. I had no idea how to deal with it. Uh, was facing a moment. I said, the waves were huge. The riptides were enormous. It was an impossible situation. I was fighting the riptides. You don't fight riptides. You swim parallel to shore. That's just a little bit of a how-to if you like to go to the ocean, as I do. I still live near the ocean because I haven't quite let go of my love of that edge, but I've grown up a little bit about it. So I came to a point where I said, "I'm going to die." And just a sense of, and I got crushed by a wave. And then I came up and I was rising. I said, "Oh, I'm coming up above I'm coming up again." But I wasn't coming up above into the water. I was above the water. And I suddenly had the experience of leaving my body through the back of my head. I'd never had an out of body experience. I'd never heard of the phrase. I had not discovered religious, mystical, spiritual, parapsychological stuff. Had not read the book Journeys Out of the Body by Robert Monroe. I left my body through the back of my head, saw the swimmer named Keith. I said, "Oh, that couldn't be me because I'm the seeing of this." That's So there's suddenly a recognition that the place from which I had been seeing all of life was now something seen, being seen from a larger 360-degree perspective. On the shore over there were all my friends, including Mary, who were saying, Keith, Keith, come back, come in. You know, they were trying to help me. They couldn't go out, try to save me. They would have drowned too. I was drowning, apparently, by all sides. And I went to Mary, my friend Mary, who stood at the beach. She was saying to another friend of ours, why didn't he listen? I told him it was too rough. Don't go in over your knees. You know, why didn't he listen? I told him it was too dangerous. She was saying it about the same volume, the same register that you and I are speaking right now. And I heard it 200, well, I heard it. The body didn't hear that. 200 yards out into the ocean or whatever it was with the enormous crashing of the waves. So I heard that non-locally. And I went to her non-locally and I said, I'm actually fine. Dead isn't dead. I had that thought. I said, whoa, dead isn't dead. And I had a sense of peace, tranquility. It was the most deeply serene experience that, okay, the death is not anything to fight. I'm now going to be dead. And long story short, I wasn't my time. By the way, I'd never heard of the near-death experience. The book had been written by Raymond Moody, Life After Life. I'd never read it. I was too busy having a life after life experience. I'm in my 20s. I didn't want to read about near death. I was trying to get near life as
Yeah.
big as I could. I just run a marathon. I was crazy enough to get into crazy waves that even the locals said, there goes a dumb kid. They said afterwards, we saw what you were doing. We wondered if you had no sense. But I wanted to go big and bold. So the next day, I told my friend after I survived. Oh, by the way, I came out onto the shore, and my first response was, oh, by the way, coming in near the very end, there were two dolphins that were by my side, sort of escorting me, and I was aware of it, and I came out onto the shore, and my friends came in and pulled me up. I had some scrapes and scratches, but fortunately, no fundamental damage. I don't think, and I don't think I died. It was a near-death experience, but it was with the certainty that I had died. And ever since then, I have had that on that day I lost all fear of death. I don't know how this life will end, but I'm not worried about it. And it's given me a sense of confidence. And in any case, the next day, I said to my friend Mary, back at the house, I said, could we go for a walk? She said, sure. I said, I'm going to tell you something. I heard what you said on the beach. She says, what do you mean? Yesterday, you said, why didn't he listen? Why did he go out? I told him it was too dangerous. And just the blood drained from her face. And she was not well educated. She hadn't heard of the near death experience either. By the way, on the shore the previous day, they said, we thought you had given it up out there. I said, I did. That's exactly it. I died. And now I'm back. And James, I looked at them and I knew I was as lucid as I've ever been, by the way. I was not in an altered state. I was in an expanded state. I had just been the whole universe. Second time I had been the whole universe, which, by the way, we all are in some way that is not easy to understand. It doesn't require understanding, but we're also individual openings, individual identities. So I said to my friends, did you see this? Did you see this? What? This is this awaken, this other realm. And they said, no. So I realized, oh, okay, this is not something I should talk about casually. This won't go well. It's the first clue I got. But talking with my friend Mary, we developed a synergy, a sympathy, a resonance about this. And then the story ends. I said I'd keep this short. I've already violated that promise. Let me bring it to a conclusion. So we stayed in touch. We talked about life and death. We talked about death as being the primordial fear underlying all others, the fear of non-existing. Isn't it not existing? Isn't that the deepest fear we all have in a relationship that really matters? The marriage, the child, family, parental relationship. We lose that relationship. We feel our very being is going to be shattered. We lose a job. There are all kinds of versions of that loss it actually constellates that deeper sense that if I die, I won't be here anymore. So we talked a lot about that. Near the end of her life, Mary was suffering a health. She was suffering ill health, and she called me one day, and she said, "Hi, Keith, it's Mary." I said, "Mary, how are you?" She goes, "Well, I'm sick again." I said, "How sick?" She said, "I'm dying." I said, "How's that going?" We had a lot of fun. And she said, "Oh, you know me, madam, little Miss Thorough. I'm diligent about everything." I said, "Well, good for you. Give it everything you've got. I hear they give Death with Diligence awards." So she laughs and I laugh. She goes, "I was wondering if you could come see me." And I said, "Sure. When?" She goes, "How about tomorrow?" I said, "I'll be there." "Do you have plans?" "Yes, I'm planning to come see you. If you can fit me in your busy social schedule." And she laughed again. So I went to see Mary and we sat and we talked. And she said, "You're still not afraid?" And she was referring to the fact that you lost fear of death. I said, "Yeah, I'm still not afraid." And she said, "You heard what I said on the beach." And she said it as if she wanted me to say it again. I said, "I did hear you." We sat in silence. And I said, "You remember those times in your life that were about as miserable as they could be? Pretty awful?" She goes, "Oh, yeah." "Do you remember how you never lost faith in being?" Sure, right. I didn't, or I wouldn't be here. I said, "Keep that up. Keep that up." And that's actually the end of the book.
Yeah.
So that's what I said to Mary that day. And that gives you some sense of how I roll with all this at this point.
Yeah. And some people on here might be familiar with my story. And I had uh, an experience that was akin to that in many different ways. So I certainly understand. And I don't wish I don't wish that on anybody particular to be in that kind of situation, but I wouldn't have it any other way. I think that that kind of experience can teach you a lot. It can show you a lot.
It
And
really can. And some people will say, "Gee, I wish I could have a near-death experience." No, you don't need to have a near-death experience in order to have that, because it teaches us that this awakening, there's an awakened quality to life that is the state of everything always.
yeah,
And finding it here, I think I came back. Why did I come? I didn't get the voice that said, by the way, there was a whole celestial place I went. I went through the tunnel that I did not know existed, went through a black field with enormous sound and explosive, lots of effects that I now know are widely reported in the near-death experience, very similar to the Tibetan Book of the Dead,
yeah,
the Bardo states that people go through. I saw deceased relatives. I did not have a Christian heaven oriented framework, so I did not have a lot of pre-existing images of heaven. I say that only because I understand the explanation that skeptics offer. And I've read, by the way, one of the things I did because of when I came back from that experience and knew that nobody around me was open to the idea that you die and come back. So then I found the work of Dr. Raymond Moody. I got to know Dr. Ken Ring, a major near-death experiencer. I sort of tutored him about UFO stuff, and he tutored me on my near-death experience and provided a lot of support for understanding that these have been reported throughout antiquity. So I say to people, I know there are many near-death people who have come back with injuries because they've had surgery or they've had a car accident. Physically, their body is not a good place to be. They want to go back there. And all I can say is I don't know where there is, but it is not separate from here. That the place that is called heaven is it's not a place you could go only when you die. I think that the afterlife stuff is very powerful information. I'm very glad that Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies has funded so much good research on postmortem survival of consciousness. But we're here to learn how to bring that big space into this life as much as possible, which is why in one of my chapters of my book, I titled, "Who Do We Think We Are?" There are a lot of capacities of mind body, larger mind body that are in our various in our direct experience that we don't make the connection. What do we think an athlete, a major athlete in any sport is talking about when they're in the zone? And they'll privately say things like, when I was in the zone, man, when I was in the zone, what was in the zone? First of all, time and space slowed down. And I knew I had all the time I needed to complete this pass on the football field. And I did complete the pass. And I heard this super sensory music. And see, these are larger states that are actually who we are now. We don't have a lot of social support to live into them. Those moments when the phone rings, you say, oh, I'll pick up the phone. And by the way, I haven't thought about, I wonder whatever happened to John from high school. Thinking about him lately. Turns out it's John from high school. 20 years later, those coincidental calls that are what Jung called synchronicity. The synchronicity is a big part of understanding the UFO phenomenon, the paranormal. It is a fundamental linchpin. These crossings of the correspondences of similarities that are uncanny connections between mental and physical reality. They're not supposed to exist, but they continue to pop up.
Right. And you almost had a synchronicity yourself with in writing the Angels and Aliens book. Uh, that ended up putting you in touch with Lawrence Rockefeller. So I wanted to shift gears a little and get into that whole thing, because I know people that are interested in kind of the current phase of, let's say, disclosure, that
Right.
that actually kind of where we are now, there's a history to that, and how we got here. And I think that meeting has a little bit something to do with that.
Well,
So
yeah, it was. I had written that book, and I got to know. Well, I one day I received a phone call, and the operator said, "Would you be willing to make time to talk with Lawrence Rockefeller?" And I said, "Sure." When that it be? When setting up an appointment to talk to Lawrence Rockefeller. He said, "He's on the phone right now." Oh, okay. So, long story short, he said, Mr. Thompson, this is Lawrence Rockefeller. I have read your book, Angels and Aliens. And he had some interesting observation. He said, you, you take what I call a big picture approach. And I said, well, thank you. And by the way, call me Keith. And he said, then you'll call me Lawrence, and we'll have those formalities out of the way. Yeah, I do his voice because I can still hear it. He was 84 at the time, I think. He was somewhere between Spencer Tracy and Henry Fonda On Golden Pond. He was the Rockefeller brother who had a metaphysical and philosophical quest, in addition to being a very successful and cagey businessman, entrepreneur. So he said, Mr. Thompson, I'm going to schedule a meeting at a ranch in Wyoming, my family ranch. I'd like you to come. I'm going to lobby President Clinton. We're going to do an initiative to President Clinton and Hillary, both of whom are interested. The administration is young. He seems open to being more transparent about this subject. I'd like you to come and help brainstorm about this. Would you be available? I can remember kind of thinking, well, let me check my busy social schedule, see if I can make, yeah, I can make it. I can come to that. And he interestingly said, I'd like you to come a couple days earlier than the meeting because I want to explore this business of consciousness that you refer to. And I know that it's crucial to this, that these are physical objects, physical events to be sure, but their behaviors are not what we would associate with physicality. I mean, he was a very smart guy. He's very well informed. So what he had decided to do was to lobby, to extend diplomatic outreach to the Clinton administration to try to get them to come to be more disclosing, to be more transparent, to release the documents around Roswell. The decision was made, let's focus on the Roswell case. So I went to JY Ranch. John Mack was there. Linda Moulton Howe was there. Stephen Greer was there. All of us younger and than we are now. Lawrence and his wife Mary were both there. So for 3 or 4 days, we just brainstormed how would we do this. I can't tell you there was any great there was any great information release. People say, "What really happened at the?" When you associate with the name Rockefeller, well, what really happened? Now, can you tell the real story? Well, the real story I can tell you was Lawrence Rockefeller had a genuine and sincere interest as a public citizen in helping to advance the ball on this subject. As you know from the book, what actually happened was an outreach was made. They agreed to push the release of any information around Roswell. After a certain amount of time, a response came back. We are writing to inform you that we have found nothing. Well, surprise. The people who might have been in on a, call it cover up, check the records. There was no evidence of a cover up. Really? Okay, that's a surprising outcome. Oh, Rockefeller was disappointed by this response. His people around him were outraged that this was the response. I wasn't particularly surprised. I didn't. I actually had that thought that you're asking the people who have some interest in holding back material to now admit that they have been holding back material. In any case, as you know, not long after that happened, it was discovered that all of the documentation for a 5-year period, including 2 years prior to the Roswell event, had suddenly gone missing. So all I can say is I don't even write about Roswell as such in this new book because it's, to me at this point, such a deep rabbit hole of he said, she said, and I don't think we're going to get direct answers. But I can say this much: something happened at Roswell that led government people to go door to door demanding that if you have any of the material, you'd better give it up and you better not be holding on to it. So something crashed out there. I know there are different views about what is it Annie Jacobs? Is that her name? The journalist believes it might have been a Soviet craft with deformed children who were confused as aliens. I don't know. I really don't know. But it was not, it was very likely, James, not a meteorological balloon. Okay. It was not a
Yeah.
weather balloon. But this is a perfect example of a case that we have not gotten direct answers. You know, the first news release that went out was that it was a recovered disc. When you lead with that as a cover story and then go to the meteor, that's an interesting kind of concealment process. Um, I don't know if we'll ever get to the bottom of it. But anyway, Rockefeller, near the end of his life, we talked, and he said, I hope you'll stay in this. I hope you'll keep asking questions. I said, I know you will. And he said, it's been a great pleasure to work with you on this. There was something he said at the ranch in Wyoming when we had a conversation by a rock, the two of us. We were talking about near-death experiences. We were talking about paranormal phenomena. And we stood up. He said, "Well, I think that's about all we have time for now. We'll continue this conversation." And we both looked into the beautiful mountains, and the sun was setting. He said, "The beauty, the wonder never ends." So at the end of the conversation, I said, "I remember when you said the wonder never ends." He said, "No, it doesn't. And we'll just keep at this, won't we?" So I write about that in the chapter, and that's as close as I come to disclosure. For me, the real disclosure is the phenomenon itself. It's not to say that I have a complete respect for David Grush and those who are pursuing the documents, the efforts in Congress, the whistleblowers, all of that. It's just not my métier, not my milieu. But because I think the ultimate disclosure is the events themselves, and we're the disclosure ultimately, all of us.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's an important point is, we're looking at the UFO phenomenon as, I don't know, maybe you can say something that's out there, and out, yeah, there are elements that are like that, but like you said, with this doubleness, it's in part this phenomenon that we can observe, that there's alleged crashes, yet one of the biggest takeaways that we have from the UFO phenomenon is our own experience of it. So
There was a man named Dennis Sant, Sant. I never met him, but he was reported related to the Hudson Valley
yeah, that's where
sighting.
I am. Yeah.
Yeah, so he in I came across his anecdotes. It's a very simple anecdote, but it somehow became very powerful for me. He was driving along, and for 20 minutes, he watched what appeared to be a craft, okay, just like right out of Close Encounters. During that 20-minute period, he said, I had a process of life review. I reviewed every detail of my life. And I read that. I said, first of all, that is what is commonly reported in their near death experience. I had a review of my own life in my own near death, a reliving of my own life in which I had experienced. When I say every event in my own life, it's almost phenomenally hard to imagine what that means. But you experience events such as being punished by your father, in which you understand completely why he punished you, for breaking the family rule, let's say. You understand why he acted as he did, because he was punished as by his father. I saw karmic, if you will, levels and sense of forgiveness that is essential to understanding how everything is connected. So when Dennis Sant said, for that period of 20 minutes, I didn't expect to be engaging in a complete review of my entire life. So these are the senses. It's just like Kenneth Arnold. Not only did he see something that reminded him that this takes us to a deeper dimension. These physical events, he saw something in the sky that I believe you and I would have seen if we were in the same plane. So let's be clear. It is both out there and in here. So yeah, the sense in which this phenomenon is the both andness of it is perplexing, but it's something that can be just, you can say, well, that's just what it is, and we have to open to it. And speaking of disclosure, I have often been struck by how many people who've come in to be interested in the phenomenon since the 2017 New York Times article was written, and learned that the Pentagon has had an office that involved Lou Elizondo and so forth. New generation of people have learned about the likelihood that the cover-up is going to be ending soon. My only response to that as an old timer is to remind, is if I can pass on anything I've learned, it's not to discourage you, but it's to give you a sense of reasonable expectations that the idea that any day now the lid on the government cover-up is going to blow sky high has been present for 8 decades. It comes and it goes and comes and it goes. It's not to be cynical and say, oh, there's never going to be a release of information. The cover-up will never end. But just be mindful, if you've come into this with 2017, it sounds like this time for sure. But it has felt like this time for sure in other cases as well. So there's the short game and the long game. I urge people who are new to this phenomenon to develop the patience to be willing to stay with this and to realize there will be disappointments. The Congressional Disclosure Act that is currently up before Congress, the amendment may not get through. So you keep coming back. You keep coming back. And if you're in the disclosure world, then make that your work, but be willing to be patient and play the long game. There'll be a next season.
Yeah, and there's also the idea that, let's say, the United States government as an example, maybe they have retrieved objects, craft entities, non-human biologics, but that doesn't mean they exactly know what it is that they have either.
I sometimes think if I were writing a screenplay, it would be about, probably contrary to some my fellow investigators. I respect how they reach their conclusions about the government has. We have treaties with the aliens. We told them it's okay to do the abductions, so long you can do the abductions for a little longer. That kind of stuff, I go, okay, maybe that's all true. I don't ever see the evidence for that that meets my criterion. But the just that recognition, my point was going to be that the I think what the government is probably hiding in a good many cases is they don't know what's going on. And yes, something's real. They might have material. They might have biologics. It's such a strange term, biologics. It's just it's too good. It's like I say, if I'm writing a screenplay, David Grush would probably be doing what he's doing. And I don't expect a press conference where somebody at the Pentagon with a lot of medals and a uniform is going to come out and say, we're ready to disclose that there are in our airspace craft that are conducting the following maneuvers. And Lou Elizondo on 60 Minutes describes so magnificently the speed, the trajectories, the right turns, the disappearances, the reappearances. Pretty extraordinary stuff. You don't expect the government to come out and say, we don't know what it is, but it operates with impunity. We'll keep you posted. No, I don't expect that. So I think to a large extent, rather than the idea that there are treaties with aliens, I don't think so. I mean, I'm open to evidence, real evidence of that. I expect emails from someone who will say, oh, well, here's the evidence. Well, good. I'll help you break the story. But in the meantime, I think a big part of if you wear medals and a uniform and your job is to protect the public, you're not going to casually say you don't know how to protect the public. There's something that could be a threat.
Yeah. And what do you that you mentioned the word threat. So I'm just curious on your thoughts of the idea of we have this phenomenon, right? And we can argue it's part of a greater phenomenology. That's a whole conversation within itself, right? The UFO phenomenon and
Right, the
amidst,
ontological issues we're talking about.
yeah. But for the sake of this conversation, we have this, as you described in the book, otherness, right? This potential other non-human intelligence, if we can try to categorize it with words in a way that we understand currently. We have this non-human intelligence engaging with us, and the idea of threat comes up, right? Is do UFOs present a threat? What are your thoughts on that conversation?
I think Lou Elizondo touched on that. He said, "Do they have?" And Chris Mellon, I think they both said, "Does this have the capacity for threat? Does it have threat potential?" It would certainly be wise to consider that events of this kind may have that, certainly have the capacity. It's certainly worth monitoring our airspace. These pose a threat to our own pilots and our own personnel. But I think it's Jeff Kripal at Rice University has been very good on tracking the extent to which the UFO conversation has been captured, you might say, and colonized by the military industrial metaphors. There is military industrial presence and fingerprints throughout this. I mean, they have been tracking it very carefully. I mean, the hidden, not so well hidden message of the 2017 New York Times story is our government decided to disclose that the phenomenon about which they had been ridiculing witnesses for decades had been studied by our government. It's a pretty powerful admission of duplicity. So I understand the deep suspicions, but I think Jeff came up with the phrase. He said, "It's like, are we going to start shooting down souls?
Hmm.
Is that what we're doing? Souls, SOULS. I mean, if the he's not saying that there's not a hardware component to it. It's a both andness to it that it is. What is it that is materialized? I'm going to shift gears here. What is it that's materialized in seances? The materializations that are called apports, physical phenomena. I understand that there was some percentage of those that are fake. There's always hoax. The
Yeah.
debunkers capture hoax. I love the idea of hoax, but the line between mind and matter is pretty hard to maintain. So the and Jung talked. So I'm all over the place here, but there's a physical component to this, a psychic component. It's both. This phenomenon crosses over into both. For example, in one case, a sighting of a craft that shows up with geometric proportions. It has turbulence associated with it. It appears to, if it lands, it causes ground indentations. It breaks limbs. It causes animals to go berserk. It causes human eyes to go red, and you get conjunctivitis. Pretty consistent with something in time and space as we know it. And then it breaks into two or three craft. Two of those break into orbs. Some of them go into the ground. They become transparent. This is within the same, and then they disappear like a TV set turning off. This is just a gold mine for debunkers. They'll love to cite what I just said and said, so we're asked to believe that this is worth the time of science? My answer is yes. You're not asked to believe it, but it should be worth. Um, Charles Darwin didn't go along the shores of the Galapagos Islands saying, well, this is an interesting fossil, but I'm going to decide in advance that doesn't fit the other fossils I've got in my collection from this very walk. I think I'll exclude it. No, he brought the one in that didn't fit. And that's how he got a larger pattern, which if you want to go there now, I'll simply say my main criticism of the main two abduction researchers, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, is not the criticism of a debunker. I simply criticized the degree to which they both, especially Dave Jacobs, had a kind of selection bias.
Yeah.
David Jacobs would say, well, these people who were describing reincarnation experiences, or they said they saw dead relatives. We have to exclude that kind of data because that's
Yeah.
just spiritual, psychological stuff. Oh, Lord, I read his own open description of how he decided what to consider and not. I thought, man, if you were trying to debunk your own data pool, my friend, you couldn't have done a better job. This is not to say he was not a stalwart. He was a professor of history at Temple University, and he paid a big price in his career for having the interest that he had. John Mack had the same thing, the same response. It's the institutional pressure. They were both what Thomas Berger, the sociologist I quoted, they were cognitive minorities. The abductee is a cognitive minority. They're reporting knowledge that can't be real. It didn't happen. That doesn't happen. You're insane. You're sick, mentally ill. This is the kind of pushback. It's very hard being an experiencer. I say that not asking for sympathy, because I sat in quiet with my own experience for a long time. I sought out people who would understand it. But in any case, I would have touched on a lot here, but that's a big part of my criticism with the abduction stuff. The reason I criticize those two researchers is because I think if they weren't excluding so many kinds of samples that didn't fit their own materialist physicalist bias, we would find that the abduction stuff is real and much stranger than we know. And I'm for being willing to allow it to be stranger than it than we might want it to be. I'm not for making it stranger than it is, but if we exclude the stuff and we smooth stuff away so that it will be acceptable to the materialists, then we're misreporting. And I'm in favor. Again, I use the Darwin metaphor. He didn't say, "Well, this fossil, I'm going to throw." No, he got the largest sample. And when you get the larger sample, then you've got the kind of findings that Dr. Jacques Vallée found in Passport to Magonia. You have a larger sample of stuff that doesn't fit a simple, maybe a simple abduction um, scenario. You've got to consider the degree to which human capacity to have larger mind-body experiences um, are relevant. For example, I've often thought, James, if more abductees, especially those who had repeat experiences, were to have, if there were, imagine a training institute. This could be a screenplay again, a training institute where people who've had non-ordinary experiences would would have training in some of the techniques that martial artists have with their subtle bodies, with their ki and their chi. And if we practice, what if we were taught lucid dreaming techniques from childhood? What if we were taught to understand that throughout and since antiquity, the body, the body, we leave our bodies and can leave our bodies and travel in subtle bodies. Every mythology of the world, the Egyptians, the Ba and the Ka, these are terms for the different kinds of sheaths or subtle bodies. If we were to develop our full capacities with our full levels of embodiment, mind body capacities, would we find that we're actually on common ground with aliens rather than being victimized by them? People are taken against their will. I understand that's reported. But what if people had more with with other levels of intelligence and other levels of embodiment? That's what interests me at this point. I do think we're meeting this phenomenon on common ground of our own larger super nature.
Yeah, and it's actually funny that you mentioned some of those terms and ideas because I'm working on a presentation that's going to be out in a few weeks that directly uh, touches on all that. And again, that kind of, in a sense, that brings us back to the Kenneth Arnold uh, thing about these potentially living beings. I mean, in the way that what we consider out of body experience, subtle energy, and those kind of ideas could be something that whatever is behind the UFO phenomenon sees as, um, they're more aware of that realm and our connection to that realm as well.
On that same very point, Bud Hopkins famously declared that the paradigm case for abduction should be the Betty and Barney Hill case. And he wrote in, I believe, in Missing Time, maybe that was the first where he wrote it, or it was Intruders. But in any case, he wrote, let's make that case. If it follows the model of the Betty and Barney Hill case, it's probably a legitimate abduction. That's another example of a creation myth. He established the Betty and Barney Hill case as the creation myth for modern abductions. Okay, that's beautiful. What's not widely known about the Betty and Barney Hill case is that they had poltergeist activity in their home. They'd come home and the coats would be out of the closet. There would be objects moving across tables. Stuff that, again, debunkers love to sneer at because that's the response of a debunker, not a genuine skeptic. Genuine skeptic says, well, give me more evidence. What did you find? They ask good questions. It's just like with the Ken Arnold sighting, the Betty and Barney Hill case had paranormal phenomena unrelated or related to the abduction. So if Bud Hopkins is right, if we're going to consider the Hill case to be truly an exemplary case for abductions, then we would we would call it, cook it in. We would cook in the paranormal stuff right in the recipe. It would be in the very. I think, for example, that many abductees report opening up to paranormal capacities, telepathy, clairvoyance, out of body travel. That tends to be dismissed because if you're a UFO researcher, you're trying to establish a case that the abductions are crime scene, hardcore detective cases where people are physically taken out of their beds and out of their cars and go through these procedures, which I'm very familiar with what's reported, and I'm not a debunker. These are real experiences. I don't think we haven't begun to understand as well as we could what the experience entails because we don't know who we are. We don't know who they are because we don't fully understand our own nature. So I think we've got to be willing to open up to the idea that our own nature is continuing to evolve, that that may be developing extraordinary human capacities, which places like Esalen Institute, the home of what has become known as the Human Potential Movement, and has been very generous to me and my work, inviting me to conferences and allowing me to present my ideas. We need this kind of big picture stuff. That's why I devoted a chapter to Bob Bigelow, the Bigelow factor, I called it, because I know that Bob Bigelow is controversial. Good. That means he's doing something. If you're not controversial about something, you haven't shown up, okay? But what are you controversial for? Because he asked some big questions, and he uh, has devoted a lot of his wealth to asking these big questions. So I'm hoping that with that kind of work, the kind of work Esalen Institute does, the Rice University Archives for the Impossible, I think it's actually a very promising time for new philanthropy, new enterprises, new conversations, new conferences. I think that may be something we can expect in the near
Yeah.
future.
And we have the Soul Foundation as well.
The Soul
And
Foundation, absolutely. That Gary Nolan has simply said, you can come to this conference and we will speculate. He's often says, that he'll be criticized. Your hypothesis, Dr. Nolan. He said, no, 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 no. I didn't say that's my hypothesis. I said I was speculating. Speculation is a stage in the hypothesis formation process. So thank goodness people like Gary Nolan are willing to speculate openly, take risks. John Mack speculated very openly. He had a lot of questions about his first book, in Passport to the Cosmos. He rethought some of what he wrote in the first book, Abduction. He was working on a third book in which he left us too soon, my friend. John
yeah,
left too soon. He walking on the streets in London, didn't know which way the cars were were going because he thought they came from one direction. He had an assumption as an American and left us too soon. But he was asking, oh, he was really ready to ask. And I ask very important questions. I would emphasize, as I often do, that John Mack came to this after opening up to holotropic breath work. He got to know Dr. Stan Groff, had begun to use the same inquisitive approach that he had done as a Freudian psychotherapist and his remarkable work at Harvard. He said, I'm now going to explore other realms through experiential methods of exploring the further reaches of consciousness. It's not a difference in kind, it's a difference of kinds of experience, but it's the same exploratory approach. So he came to the abductions phenomena with an interest in transpersonal, cosmic, deep metaphysical questions. And as you know, he's often cited, gee, he tends to get in touch with abductees or experiencers who report transformative dimensions of their experience in a way that, let's say, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs did not. Is there a certain sense in which a, a researcher creates a space in which certain kind of phenomena can show up? Yeah, I think there is. I think that's part of what has to be controlled for, but also has to be welcomed that John Mack found things that others weren't finding.
Yeah, and you had a somewhat of a history of John Mack, is that correct?
I did. I had written or given a talk at a conference called the Rocky Mountain UFO Conference in Laramie, Wyoming. At my entry to the abduction material was to, because I have a background in mythology and I knew Joseph Campbell personally. I took workshops from him before he was famous,
Oh,
and I
wow, yeah.
already the hero's journey metaphor, the hero's journey process had struck me as very relevant. So I wrote a paper and gave a talk on the UFO encounter experience as a catalyst for transformation. And I used the initiatory process, the abductee. I said, here's what I did. In the talk, I said, let us set aside the reality questions of what's actually going on. Just set them aside for now. They're not irrelevant. They're not unimportant. We set them aside and simply say, let's compare these to initiations, rites of passage. So this was eventually published in a book that Dr. Stan Groff and his late wife, Christina Groff, published. And Stan Groff gave the paper to John Mack. So John, you might be interested with your growing interest in the UFO stuff. So he sat down and read it. I'm told Ralph Bloomberg writes about it in his biography, of John Mack, the Believer, and said that John Mack read it and said, "Well, it's all very interesting, but are they real?" So he said, I need to get in touch with this Keith Thompson. So I get an email from John Mack, said, we need to talk. I said, sure, let's talk. So he told me when we got to know each other, he said, you know, Keith, if I had not read your paper, I might not have ever gone down this road of getting interested in this stuff. And I said, is that giving me credit or blame? And he laughed, that wonderful blue-eyed laugh of his. He said, well, for now, I'll give you credit, but it's subject to revisiting it. And we used to joke when he was getting in trouble at Harvard for daring to continue to go down this road. I said, are you still willing to give me credit for introducing me? He said, I give you more credit than ever. So when I say credit, it's simply that he found out about the abduction stuff through me. And then we had many, many conversations. I miss the conversations we'll never have, at least in this world. But he was a truly bright light. He asked questions. He knew Thomas Kuhn, the author of of Scientific Revolutions. I'm missing the full title. His book on scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts. And he had told John, stay with this, avoid reaching conclusions, just gather the data. John did that pretty well. He did reach some conclusions, but he was willing to revisit his hypotheses. He would form a hypothesis and then he would set it aside if it didn't seem accurate. That's what we really need to be doing.
Yeah, and just uh, as a final question, what what would you like people to take away from your book or from just investigating the UFO subject in general? What would you like people to walk away with?
I have a passage in the book where John and I were talking, John Mack and I were talking about some of these questions, but the question of reality, um, the reality questions. I was on Larry King Live for my book Angels and Aliens, and near the end, if you remember Larry King, he had this gruff, vaudevillian approach. He said, "Keith Thompson, final question. The abductions, are they real?" And I said, "Well, it depends on how we define reality." And he said, "No, no, no, no. Are they real?" I said, "Okay." You put me on the spot. I said, here's my answer to that is if you and I had the experience that is called abduction, you and I would think it was real. Now we need to ask, what is the nature of reality such that such events where people move from different forms, move as a body through strange realms, and return, that could all be happening. So what I want people to take away is something I told, or that I came away with from a conversation with John Mack. I said, UFO research and similar topics need a waiting room. We need to set up a waiting room where we can sit with questions and without having to reach immediate responses. There's such an impulse in this field called ufology in particular. Such a premium is placed on I know. My sources tell me, and we're about to learn that. This constant promissory process, and it's all based on knowing the one who shouts, I know louder than anybody else is the one we listen to. I'm going to say, I want the loudest voice to be, I don't know, but I'm looking into it. I'm in the waiting room on that issue. So I want new people who come to this someone who's been around and is not worse for the wear, or if I am worse for the wear, I'm hanging out with it pretty well. That it's okay to wait. It's okay to not know. You mentioned beginner's mind, Suzuki Roshi, the Zen master. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. Think of the areas of your life where you know what's possible. You've closed out a lot. Doesn't mean you don't know what you know. You've also got to know, we've also reached conclusions. If you don't ever know anything, you're not making good use of your time here. If you know too much, if you know everything, keep a big category of I don't know, because that's the potential to learn. That openness is the potential to learn. I don't know what happened to me at age 14 on the roof when I opened up, but I felt an every awareness to everything, a simultaneous presence of consciousness, presence of awareness that comes with me to this day. So sit with presence. It doesn't hurt to have a practice of meditation or some discipline practice of sitting quietly. It can be very useful to noticing the mental stream and noticing it as a mental stream. Oh, there's that set of thoughts that are back again. That's a very different place than, oh, I'm going to act on those thoughts. Then you go down a whole train, and 2 days later you say, well, I sure got hijacked by a lot of thinking that wasn't very productive. Whereas if you can kind of catch it and say, oh, there's that stream of thought again, it can be
Yeah.
very useful. So a waiting room, sit in the waiting room with a lot of the questions. Rilke, the famous poet, told the letter to the young artist, sit with the questions, develop a love for the question. And if answers come, ask questions about those answers too.
Definitely. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time, Keith. And I'm going to recommend that everybody check out your books. I'm going to put links in the description so people can find your books. I don't know if they can still find Angels and Aliens, but most definitely the UFO Paradox. That's available. I think it came out today, I believe, right? Or no. It's going to come out the 16th, correct?
Yeah, July 16th. And it is out there. And Angels and Aliens is out there too. It's a used book, so I don't get any benefit from pushing it, but you can find it on Amazon. And um, to the degree that it's a classic, I continue to hear from people who tell me they've got it. And so the new book is called The UFO Paradox, which is a title that, what is the UFO paradox? There's so many aspects to that, but I would say the fundamental paradox is that that is this phenomenon that at the heart of it is synchronicity, the simultaneous psychic and physical dimensions of a phenomenon that our maps of the science have not fully opened up to. But Just real quickly, do you know that you do know the Nobel Prize 2 years ago was for the entangled particles phenomenon, where photons that are sent in opposite directions, great distances, remain in touch.
Yeah,
We
non-locality.
live in a universe of everything is in touch with everything else. So it shouldn't surprise us that things float into our realm, land, appear to be craft, change their shape, change their form, appear in as they do. What the ultimate purpose of it is perhaps to teach us that there's a bigger game going on. As I say, it's a call from the cosmos. It's news from the universe and worth listening to.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Keith, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
I do too. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care.